There was a time when the streets of Toronto were lit by gas lamps and filled with the sound of horse-drawn carriages. The air smelled of coal and fresh bread, and the city, still young, was learning how to dream. In that world of ambition and modesty, a man named Robert Simpson opened a small dry goods store in 1872, a humble beginning for what would soon become one of Canada's greatest empires of elegance. Simpsons was not just a store, it was a promise that a growing nation could build something truly its own, refined, honest, and distinctly Canadian. In an age when much of Canada's culture was overshadowed by British traditions and American influence, Simpsons became a quiet declaration of independence. It was the place where fine fabrics, crystal lamps, and polished manners met the hopeful faces of a middle class determined to rise. Inside the store, the scent of perfume mixed with the creak of wooden floors. Women in hats and gloves examined silk dresses, while young men saved their wages to buy a suit for Sunday service. The Simpsons catalogues became household treasures, a window to a world of sophistication that felt both foreign and familiar. As the decades passed, the company grew from that single Toronto store into a national institution. To shop at Simpsons was to participate in a ritual, an act of belonging to a Canada that believed in beauty, service, and dignity. It was where Christmas lights first glimmered in the hearts of downtown shoppers, where children pressed their faces against magical window displays, and where countless memories were quietly born. For generations, Simpsons stood as a reflection of a country in bloom. It wasn't only about commerce, it was about pride, the feeling that Canada could create something lasting, something graceful, something that truly belonged to its people. The war was over. The streets were alive again. In the 1950s, Canada entered an era of optimism. Suburbs were growing, cars lined the new highways, and televisions flickered in living rooms from Vancouver to Halifax. It was a time when the future felt bright and endless, and at the center of it all stood the great department stores, cathedrals of modern life. Among them, none shone brighter than Simpsons. With polished marble floors and chandeliers that glowed like captured stars, Simpsons became a sanctuary for the Canadian dream. Families came not just to shop, but to experience, to walk through aisles that seemed to promise a better life. The Simpsons brand became synonymous with quality, grace, and tradition. It wasn't just about clothes or furniture, it was about identity. In every city where a Simpsons store opened, there was a sense of pride, as if the community itself had been recognized by the nation. In 1953, the company made a bold move that would define its next chapter, a partnership with Sears, Roebuck and Company of the United States. Together, they formed Simpsons Sears Limited, dividing the territories like careful diplomats. Downtown Simpsons would remain elegant and refined, while Simpsons Sears would bring affordable goods to the expanding suburbs. For a while, it seemed like the perfect balance, prestige and practicality working hand in hand. The 1960s and 70s marked the height of the Simpsons empire. Its Christmas displays became legendary, drawing crowds who would line up for blocks to see the animated windows sparkle in winter light. The name Simpsons was printed on shopping bags carried proudly through the snow, a symbol of family, success, and belonging. Yet beneath the polished counters, quiet changes were taking place. The suburban expansion that had once fueled growth began to erode the heart of downtown commerce. The very malls that carried Simpsons' new suburban stores slowly pulled life away from the grand old buildings that had defined its legacy. Still, during this golden age, Simpsons was more than a retailer. It was a reflection of post-war Canada itself. confident, polite, and quietly ambitious. But like all reflections, it depended on light, and somewhere far ahead, the shadows were beginning to gather. By the late 1970s, the golden glow of Simpsons began to dim. The world outside its grand display windows was changing faster than anyone could have imagined. Families were moving to the suburbs, far from the downtown streets where the great department stores had once thrived. Shopping had become a different experience, faster, more practical, less ceremonial. The rise of suburban malls promised convenience over elegance, parking lots over marble floors. For the first time, the rituals of shopping were leaving the heart of the city. Inside the company, the shift was slow to be understood. Simpsons had built its reputation on refinement and loyalty, believing that quality and heritage would always guarantee survival. But times were moving in another direction. Younger generations were drawn to modernity, to color, to music, to speed. The air of sophistication that once defined Simpsons began to feel distant, beautiful but old-fashioned. In 1978, Hudson's Bay Company acquired Simpsons. It seemed like a natural partnership, two of the oldest and most respected Canadian retailers joining forces. Yet beneath the surface, the identity of each began to blur. The Bay expanded aggressively, while Simpsons struggled to redefine itself. Two brands from the same family were suddenly competing for the same customers, and the overlap drained the strength of both. At the same time, new threats emerged. American retailers began their quiet invasion, with modern marketing, standardized pricing, and flashier stores. They understood a truth that Simpsons had overlooked. The consumer was no longer loyal to heritage, but to habit and price. The world had become impatient, and in that impatience, tradition lost its power. By the mid-1980s, Simpsons stores still stood proudly in major cities, but their corridors echoed differently. The aisles were quieter, the displays more predictable, the energy subdued. The store that had once defined Canadian elegance now seemed like a ghost of its former self. Simpsons had not collapsed overnight. It had faded, slowly, gently, almost politely, the way a sunset disappears behind a skyline. And as the last light of its golden age faded, few realized they were watching not only the decline of a brand, but the beginning of the end for the great Canadian department store era itself. In 1991, the final curtain fell. The Hudson's Bay Company announced that the name Simpsons would disappear from Canada's city streets. After nearly 120 years of history, the elegant letters that had graced building facades from Toronto to Halifax were quietly taken down. There were no fireworks, no parades, no mourning crowds, only the soft sound of metal being unscrewed and signs lowered into trucks. For those who worked there, it felt like losing a piece of their own story. Managers who had once worn crisp suits and polished smiles watched as departments were consolidated and renamed. Sales clerks who had greeted generations of customers packed up their counters and folded their last garments. The perfume of the store lingered for a moment longer than the people who had made it come alive. Some buildings survived, reborn under the banner of Hudson's Bay. The Great Simpsons store on Queen Street in Toronto remained open, but its soul was different. The chandeliers still hung above, the marble floors still reflected the light, yet something invisible had vanished. A sense of intimacy, of belonging, of home. Across the country, shoppers adapted quickly. The new branding seemed modern, efficient, inevitable. But for many there was a quiet ache, a realization that another fragment of the Canadian identity had slipped away without resistance. When the final Simpsons receipt was printed, an era ended not with a bang, but with a whisper. The lights dimmed, the doors closed, and the echoes of laughter, footsteps, and piano jingles faded into silence. What remained was a memory of window displays that once made children dream, of polished counters and gentle smiles, of a name that had once meant far more than shopping. The fall of Simpsons was not caused by one single event, but by the slow erosion of an old world meeting a new one. The 20th century's final decades were ruthless to institutions that refused to evolve. Where tradition once inspired loyalty, efficiency now commanded obedience. The quiet charm that had defined Simpsons was no longer enough in a marketplace obsessed with speed, volume, and price. Globalization changed everything. American retail giants crossed the border with dazzling marketing budgets, aggressive expansion, and a promise of lower prices. Walmart, Kmart, and others rewrote the rules of competition. They built vast suburban spaces where shoppers could park freely, move quickly, and buy more for less. The department store, once a temple of discovery, began to look like a relic of slower times. Simpsons, with its emphasis on service and refinement, couldn't survive the race it never wanted to run. Internally, the merger with Hudson's Bay blurred its identity. Two proud names sharing the same market confused the public. Was the Bay the modern future, or was Simpsons still the symbol of classic Canadian elegance? Without a clear voice, both suffered. Technology delivered the final blow. By the late 1980s, the world was on the edge of digital change. Consumers were beginning to dream of catalogs delivered not to their doors, but to their screens. Simpsons, built on paper catalogs and physical charm, had no place in this invisible revolution. But deeper than economics or technology was something cultural, a shift in how Canadians saw themselves. The old symbols of respectability and tradition were fading. The new Canada was global, fast and pragmatic. Simpsons didn't fail because people stopped loving it. It failed because the world it belonged to no longer existed. Even after its disappearance, Simpsons continued to live quietly in the architecture, memories, and emotions of those who had known it. Walk through downtown Toronto today, and you can still feel its presence on Queen Street. The same walls, the same marble floors, the same subtle aura of refinement that once defined an entire generation of Canadian shoppers. Though the name above the doors has changed, the soul of the place whispers through every polished column and every echoing hallway. For many Canadians, Simpsons was never just a department store. It was a part of their personal timeline. It was where couples bought their first furniture after marriage, where parents took their children to see the Christmas windows glow with mechanical wonder, where teenagers bought their first adult outfit before a job interview. Those rituals, however ordinary, formed the emotional fabric of a country discovering prosperity and self-confidence. In a deeper sense, Simpsons reflected the Canadian character, reserved but proud, modest but ambitious, elegant without arrogance. Its disappearance left a cultural void that no modern chain could truly fill. Today's retail landscape is efficient, uniform, and global. It sells convenience, not connection. The department store era, with its personal touch and human rhythm, feels like a relic of gentler times. Yet the nostalgia that surrounds Simpsons is not just about longing for the past. It is a reminder of what Canada once valued: craftsmanship, civility, and belonging. These qualities, though out of fashion in the marketplace, remain timeless in spirit. In the end, Simpsons' greatest legacy is not a building or a logo, but a feeling, the quiet pride of walking through a place that made everyday life feel special. And that memory, soft but unbroken, still belongs to Canada. Time has a way of erasing what once seemed permanent. The grand halls of Simpsons, once filled with music, perfume, and laughter, now belong to memory. Yet if you listen closely, You can almost hear the echo of footsteps on marble, the soft voice of a clerk greeting a customer, the faint melody of Christmas chimes drifting through a decorated atrium. What vanished in 1991 was not just a store, it was a chapter of Canadian identity. Simpsons was born in a hopeful nation, thrived in an era of optimism, and faded in a century that no longer had time for nostalgia. But within its rise and fall lies the story of an entire country learning how to adapt, how to modernize, and how to remember. Its disappearance marked more than the loss of a business. It signaled the end of a slower, more gracious Canada. One that believed in loyalty, craftsmanship, and human connection. Today, the buildings remain, but the spirit has become a ghost that lives in the collective memory of Canadians. It reminds us that progress always comes with a cost, and that sometimes what we call efficiency takes away the beauty of being part of something familiar, something ours. If you remember Simpsons, the windows, the jingles, the feeling of walking through its doors, share your story in the comments below. And if you've never known it, let this serve as a reminder. History lives not only in wars and monuments, but in the places where we laughed, dreamed, and shopped together. Subscribe for more stories of Canada's forgotten giants.